Thank you for listening to ClassicalU's podcast, for following us with our courses, training teachers, parents, school leaders on ClassicalU.com. On the podcast, we interview guests that are recording with us, leaders and authors that we're in conversation with related to how to run a great classroom, how to deliver the liberal arts, great books, classical languages to your students. We also have a webinar series, live learning events that is in collaboration with Scholé Academy and Scholé Communities. Encourage you to watch for those as well. Those are monthly, and we're delighted to have you. Thank you. I'm recording today with the guest that we have, creating a new course with ClassicalU on Wendell Berry and how he illustrates virtues that we can bring to our students in the classroom through his literary arts. We're recording with Dr. Jeffrey Bilbro at Grove City, English professor, and very excited to talk to him about a variety of topics. We'll see how much we have time for here together. But Jeff, it's wonderful to have you with us at Classical Academic Press and ClassicalU, and I'm eager to hear about, I know that there's a book that this course is really, referencing that you wrote, but I think it's already 3 books behind your book writing work. What are, as you sort of introduce yourself to our audience, for those who might not know you, what are the subsequent works that you've done before the content we'll be talking about primarily with the ClassicalU course?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Jesse. It's been great to be here the last couple of days and work with you and the rest of the team. Yeah, I think one of the great things about teaching at a small college is I can research and write about whatever I feel led to do, and nobody cares, so it's pretty great. In addition to Wendell Berry and sort of education-related things, a lot of my research recently has been on 19th century American literature and the shifts that happened in that era with the industrialization of print. So things like the rotary press, telegraph, first photography technologies, and how that really revolutionized the media. And it was very disorienting to live through. In some ways, I think it was more disorienting to live through that set of shifts than it has been for those of us who have lived through the digital revolution.
Wow, that's quite a claim.
Well, if you think about it, the telegraph, it was the first technology that was binary, really. And it's also it brought the time that information takes to move from weeks or months in many cases to instantaneous. And the internet just sort of takes that same instantaneity, same speed, and expands it to more information, right? But it doesn't change the speed. So it's been interesting. So I had a book on kind of a Christian theology book, How Should Christians Think About the News, that draws on some of that and some older material. And then I have a book out next month, actually, on how some of these authors from the 19th century might give us wisdom for living well in a digital age with digital technologies.
Mm-hmm. There's a book you were involved with as well, I think as one of the editors, contributors. There was a whole team about the liberal arts, and I think it was reviewed in Principia, the Classical Education Journal, and some other spaces. I really enjoyed the book. What was the genesis of that project, and how would you describe the overlap or contact points with classical education renewal and schools doing classical education?
Yeah, that book, a bunch of us started talking online in 2020 right after COVID hit. I had not yet lost my job, but I was soon to lose my job, and actually everybody, all 3 of us editors, either were furloughed or quit or lost our jobs during that season. It was very tumultuous, obviously, in education. Mm-hmm. And so we were trying to figure out how can we serve our current students well, as we go to Zoom real fast. But also, how do we think, already we knew our schools are under economic, but even maybe more important, kind of cultural and political and philosophical pressures. We feared distort their missions and to not educate students in the kind of formative ways that they were designed to, were made to. And so we wanted to think, how can we articulate the goods of liberal education to our various constituencies? Yeah. And so we had a bunch of public conversations over the course of a year or two with teachers of all disciplines, all different kinds of institutions, both higher ed, private ed, public ed, K through 12, micro colleges, and then editors of magazines and people like people involved with Zena Hitz's Catherine Project or other kinds of community education spaces. Like, how can we think really broadly about formative? I like the word liberal. We talked about this before. Classical is kind of a weird term. Yeah. It makes sense in some contexts. It's a brand that's known. It's a great word because it's in your title, it's your name, so it's great. But it has some weird connotations. Yeah. And liberal education is also a very old classical term. Yeah. And it has in it the seed of this idea that it's an education suitable for free persons that gives them the disciplines or the arts they need to exercise their freedom well. Yeah. That we need to be formed in certain ways if we're going to use our freedom well. Otherwise, we will be, dissipated, or we'll just be follow appetite. So anyway, we went with the liberal education brand, and it was a good project. So the book ends up kind of responding to 9 or 10 common questions we get, like, isn't this elitist? Isn't this racist? Isn't this too political or not political enough? Yeah. Can I get a job? All those kind of questions. And we tried to answer them practically.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I would highly recommend it for, teachers who are thinking about how to connect with students, even high school, middle school. But, administrators thinking about how to connect with parents and talk about, what it is they're doing.
And it's definitely
not like boots on the ground.
Yeah, it's not designed to be like, this is the answer, but to at least help you think about how to answer those questions with parents and students. And
how many different contributors? Because that was one.
I don't know, 25, 27.
Yeah, because it felt like a conversation. Yeah, about really practical, important questions of what are the liberal arts. How do they serve us and in our communities? Yeah.
Yeah, it's been fun because a lot of Christian schools or classical schools or colleges have adopted it. Their faculty read it or students read it or something, and I've got to talk with a lot of those groups, and everyone is different. They apply it to their own context, and so it's been great to see it having exactly the kind of generative fruit that we hoped it would.
Yeah. So I know a significant thread in your career as an English professor and is Wendell Berry and his work. You've been an editor with the Front Porch Republic magazine that has a lot of overlap with Wendell Berry's thought, and some of your books and writing have been related to that. And you've met him, know him. This is really connected to the course that we're doing. So the way I would kind of describe the course that you've just recorded with us is helping teachers to think about how to give their students an opportunity to inhabit virtues through poems, stories, literary forms.
Exactly.
And then you've experienced the virtue through that, and now you have a taste for it and a sense of what it would be like to begin to enact that virtue in your own life, or to imitate the arts, where you provide others with opportunities to inhabit the virtues, etc. So is that an accurate description? What would you add to that?
Yeah, I mean, there's all kinds of ways I could describe it, but I think you've said it well. And I think, people who, as we talk about the virtues, the challenge is always we're describing in the abstract something that really has to be experienced. Like as we talk about in education, you need to be apprenticed to a master of the craft with a community of practitioners, and that's how the virtues are caught. You can't tell someone you should be more courageous and this is what you should do. There's not like a recipe. You become courageous by hanging out with courageous people and doing courageous things. And so that's the problem, I think, with talking about the virtues, or trying to get students to try to form character through just telling them be whatever. And I think that's a particularly relevant challenge when you're talking about virtues that sustain healthy communities, right? There's a long history of discourse. I don't really talk about it as a course, but it's kind of lying behind the book project and some of my longer thinking about this. But there's a long history of discourse about which virtues are required to sustain communities that can then form any virtue, right? I mean, McIntyre talks about this, Aristotle talks about this. And I think Berry's really concerned about that because he sees kind of coherent, healthy communities dwindling and dissolving. And so fewer and fewer people have an opportunity to experience these as they grow up in their families, in their places, in their churches, and other institutions. And if those are lost, how do you reseed them, I guess? And one of Berry's responses, I think, is, what if in my aesthetic forms of my literature, I can at least give readers a kind of taste or a feel of what it's like to, think and inhabit an idea in this virtuous mode, whatever the virtue is. And maybe the aesthetic form can be a kind of, sure, in some ways a pale, but a kind of a substitute or a kind of like on-ramp to them practicing that virtue in communities, in our own places. So I think that's really, that's why I think he doesn't just write essays, for instance, but he also writes poems and stories so that we can inhabit the ideas he's talking about and really try them on for size. So yeah, I try to look at the different genres he writes in and kind of in each lecture single out a particular virtue, try to define the virtue a little bit, show how he models it in the essays or in the poems or in the stories. Obviously it's kind of I just give you a little bit of a taste. You have to go do more reading on your own. And then reflect a little bit on how, as a teacher, ideally, obviously, you could have the chance to teach some of these stories or poems or essays to students. But even if you don't, how as a teacher might you become kind of formed, say, in humility by reading Berry's essays, and then model that humility in the classroom in ways that invite your students to practice humility. So it's a kind of a multi-step process where we want to think about the virtue, feel what it's like to inhabit that virtue, model that for our students. And so we're not saying every day, hey, students, you should be more faithful. But we're showing them what it's like to be a faithful person, giving them models and examples, allowing them to kind of experience that vicariously. And then you hope that they wake up one day as a 18-year-old going off to college, leaving the house, not only like knowing, I know what fidelity is, I know what humility is or gratitude or attention, but they have the kind of habits of mind and habits of practice and body so that they can cultivate those in their own lives and contexts. So it's very ambitious in some ways, but I think it's a huge problem, and any small beginnings we can make in our lives and in our classrooms will pay huge dividends or bear lots of fruit later on.
Well, I feel like it's a very positive way to respond to a lot of the brokenness and fragmentation, and that is fairly widely recognized, even from sort of different sides of all our polarized, categories. There's a wide recognition that we've lost a lot in terms of local culture and community, and our work lives and our church lives and our school lives all tend to be siloed off from each other. And so what I'm hearing is that's the kind of normal human way in which virtues are formed, is because you see them, as a child, being acted out in fairly holistic and cohesive ways through a dense kind of network of relationships. And as we increasingly don't have that, and children are consuming so much on screens, and their lives are fragmented into all these different parts and busy, all of that, then there's just not an opportunity to actually experience the virtues and therefore catch them. I love that word you used. But literature gives us that opportunity to taste them, to catch them, and to begin to, and so it's, you said a pale
Yeah.
a pale alternative or imitation. But I think Berry is trying, instead of just sort of woe is me,
That's
the
right.
world's gone to wreck and ruin or whatever. It's a hey, there's good things to be done in our classrooms, in our
Yeah.
homes, and literature is a fantastic, powerful, positive force to be tapped into. So
Yeah, and obviously this is focused on Barry, but I think this applies to literature more broadly. That you can take this same approach to a lot of different classical texts that you would be reading with students, and a lot of it is just kind of learning to pay attention to the literary form, and the way that that is inviting you, as a reader, as a community of readers, to practice certain kind of liturgies of thought, or certain liturgies almost of, again, vicarious action, and then as you try that out in your imagination, then you can then go try that out in your life. And literature is this. That's why I mean this is a kind of a classic defense of literature, going back to Philip Sidney's defense of poetry and other sources. But that this is why we have stories and not just didactic, rationalistic arguments. That we need stories to put flesh on ideas and help us see how they move around in the world, so that we can inhabit them ourselves. Otherwise, it's not going to stick. And this is so important for children, I think, too, in development.
what are the so the virtues that you cover are specifically virtues required for sustaining communities, which is part of the book that this is coming out of. What are the virtues that you cover?
Yeah, so I start off in looking at his poetry and how his poetry kind of picks up on these features that are crucial to attention and gratitude. And again, I sort of focus on aspects of the virtues that might be most at risk or most threatened today. And then I look at his essays and the ways that they, in kind of unexpected and surprising, interesting ways, especially for humility, the ways they model humility and hope. And I think, we live in a very, as you pointed out, kind of doom and gloom culture. A lot of young people today are very anxious and kind of paralyzed often. And so I think Barry's understanding of and model for hope is really powerful. And then I finish with his fiction, which is kind of my favorite genre of Barry's, and talk about the active capacity to remember, to kind of form memory, and the need to practice fidelity or faithfulness. And then the last one, I talk about convocation. And this I found really helpful too in thinking with students about their own understanding of career or vocation, to help them think about calling and career in terms of their response to voices that have summoned them. So convocation just means kind of called together. We often use it in academic contexts for those big meetings. But literally, Barry understands it as the way the voices gather in a place or in someone's imagination. So that, when you talk or think, your mind is a kind of collection of the voices that you've heard. The stories you've read, the movies you've watched, the songs you've heard. And, it used to be that those voices were characteristically local, your family maybe, or sort of key texts you heard read, like the Bible, or, I don't know, Pilgrim's Progress. It depends on your context. And now it's, as you pointed out, it's so often quite fragmented, and, maybe it's online influencers or something that shape our consciousness. But Barry thinks that we need to learn how to speak in response and give our lives in response to the lives of those around us who need us. And so he's really thinking about, how to become a responsible member. And I think it's really beautiful in his novel. So I try to end there, because I think in some ways that's what I found that I talk about most often with students as they're kind of weighing questions of discernment and what's the future.
So convocation sounds like it would have some contact with his idea of membership.
Absolutely, yeah.
And and to vocation,
Yeah.
which Christians have a great deal of concern
Yeah.
about.
Yeah, Burley has this line, everyone, we are all members, the only difference is those who know it and those don't. And I think convocations like that, like for all of us, our imaginaries are formed in response to the voices that we hear. And what Barry's inviting us to, the way that convocation becomes not just a reality, but a virtuous excellence or a virtuous act, is when we can participate in that more caringly, responsibly, thoughtfully, and figure out how do I meet the needs of those around me in ways that are sustainable and reflect my giftings and my disciplines that I've developed over time. So I think it's really important for students to think about their careers, not just in terms of what's my earning potential,
Right.
but now that I've been formed to be this kind of person, now that I have this kind of freedom that's been disciplined, how can I use it, liberally or generously for the blessing of the community?
Barry has some small contact with the classical Christian education world. He's a Padea Prize winner from the Circe Institute, and I've heard a couple of bits of lore connected to that. But one of the comments I think he made in connection to receiving that prize from the Circe Institute was about someone was saying what some of the greatest problems with education today, and I think he made a comment along the lines of there's too much money. If only we didn't have, if only our resources were far more limited, we might have a chance. What does he mean? With a comment like that, it's so counterintuitive.
Yeah, not many administrators think in terms of how can I get less money. Yeah, I think it's twofold. On the one hand, he is really burned out, deeply distressed by his experience at University of Kentucky, where he taught for a couple of stints and just wrestled with the bureaucratization of the university. Again, this is a big R1 school. It's not a classical school, right? But he really was deeply frustrated by the professionalization and the way that it totally betrayed, in his mind, the needs of the state. So he ultimately withdraws his papers from Kentucky when they keep taking money from some coal companies that are strip mining parts of the state, and he just thinks you don't care about the health of your state, you care about cash. And I do think that's at a certain point institutions can kind of take on their own inertia, and they can become concerned with perpetuating themselves and growing their metrics rather than serving their missions. And maybe a lot of big R1 schools are like that. And so I think he's warning classical schools, and maybe telling them, what if we saw some of the things that we see as limitations, we see those as blessings.
Yeah.
And think, how can I work within those limits to achieve goods that I couldn't do if I got too big. I think also he's really concerned with obviously graduating students that have too much debt, because then if you have all these things, again, the college context, maybe you have the climbing wall, you have the lazy river, you have all these just nice dorms, nice dining halls. Then you charge accordingly, and then students feel more and more pressure to get high-paying jobs rather than think, well, how can I put my gifts to the service of my community? Because now I got to pay off $50,000 or $100,000 in debt.
Yeah.
So it's a lot of it is like when you have too much money, then you get fancy, and then you're doing all these things. You're not just educating students. So, I mean, Barry's actually quite favorable toward, homeschooling or very kind of low overhead forms of education and formation, because he thinks those are opportunities for, real kind of moral formation to happen without the distractions that come when it starts to get institutionalized. He's also, I think, influenced by Illich. Illich was kind of down on a lot of the bureaucratization and the institutionalization of education. So there's probably more than a whiff of Illich behind some of those comments too.
Yeah. I'm particularly interested, you put a positive spin on it. So, the Christian classical school administrator who knows his teachers aren't getting paid, paid what he or she wishes they could pay, and some of these very real challenges. But to try to recognize that you're actually able to do some things positively because you're small, or because you can't, buy the big impressive tool or toy or whatever it might be. What are some examples of that, of things that teachers or school communities might be able to accomplish that they couldn't accomplish if they had more resources?
I mean, I'm intrigued by some of these kind of co-op models where it's just 1 or 2 days a week. I know a lot of schools are either only like that or they offer an option like that. And I think when you're kind of bare bones like this, maybe your teachers have to be bivocational, or you need parents to chip in. You say, I need parents to do extracurriculars because we don't have money, and every family's got to lead one of these or something. I have experience. This can be stressful and overwhelming. So I don't want to pretend like this is all butterflies and fairy tales. But then people chip in, and there's some real skin in the game and real community investment and buy-in that happens. That doesn't happen when you just pay for all that and let the professionals take care of it. So it's always more uncomfortable and ad hoc when these things return in-house. But I think if we can allow those kinds of limits to foster creativity and to foster participation, then the fruit will come, difficult and uncomfortable as it might be along the way.
Yeah. I mean, this is across the board in so many aspects of our culture, right? Where we don't take care of the dead bodies of our loved ones. I mean, in all these kinds of ways that are hard. Yeah, we've professionalized, so many aspects of life that used to be personal responsibilities.
Yeah. And education is certainly part of that big process.
Yeah. Raising a child is an extraordinarily difficult thing to do.
And now it's very expensive, right?
Yeah. And now, since we've professionalized it, it's not only continues to be extraordinarily difficult to do, but we've just made it expensive and sort of distanced ourselves, particularly from other people's children.
Yeah.
I feel like, so that's part of what a co-op, a hybrid school model. It's messy to have real responsibility for other people's children in particular.
Yeah.
That's where it's challenging. But some of the most powerful formation I know in my own children's lives is when there was some vulnerability or opportunity for other adults. I'm profoundly grateful for the ways in which my children are shaped in ways I just couldn't have done.
Yeah.
And you see that as a parent. I mean, every parent has those moments of, wow, gratitude that another adult, showed up in some way, shape, or form in their child's life. But, well, you also gave us a couple bonus lectures as a literature teacher. You're talking about some texts where you feel like you've got some ideas on ways in which they're kind of typically taught that aren't exactly unpacking the text and really, getting at the core values. How would you tease out the, give the audience a taste of what those are about?
Yeah, so I talked a little bit about how I teach Thoreau's Walden and Hawthorne's Scarlet Letter. I said 19th century American Lit's kind of my bread and butter, is my background. And I teach those at least every year, sometimes twice a year, depends on where I've been, what schedule I've had. I love these books. I'm not going to give you more. I have a lot of books like this, like Moby Dick. I teach all the time. Love it. And I think after you teach some of these books for a while, this happens when you start getting old, you realize, wow, students sometimes don't read the book because they are coming into it with these preformed expectations. They've been told this is what Walden is, this is what Scarlet Letter is, and then they read the words filtered through that. And as a teacher, I feel like I have to start off by saying, well, let me undo some of these preconceptions. Now try to encounter the text. So I just talked about some of maybe the most painful to me misconceptions I see in my students, and give a few kind of broad ideas about where to go in the text to I think, generate more interesting discussions, more interesting readings,
Yep.
and really understand both of those books in particular as kind of very carefully constructed aesthetic forms that are inviting readers into an experience of reading that can't just be boiled down to like, well, in the case of Hawthorne, the Puritans are bad, or in the case,
So that would be one of the
Yeah.
misconceptions that, like, okay, this is a book demonstrating that
how
Puritans are
bad the Puritans are. Let me talk
And,
about all, and then sometimes
it takes the life out of
Yeah.
the book.
And that's not
because
what
it's just-
Hawthorne's interested in doing anyway. Yeah. Or like with Thoreau, people think he went off to Alaska and is in the wilderness, and they find out, wait, he's like a mile from town? Wait, his mom does his laundry? Wait, he goes home for dinner every week? What? and like, yes, Thoreau never pretend, like this is a later cultural accretion that happens. Thoreau never pretends he's going off in the wilderness. It's not what he's after. Like, and if you think that, you miss what he is after.
Yeah.
So, yeah,
Wasn't there a little, this is slightly
go for it.
jumping off, with an association that may or may not be fair or helpful. But the Pilgrim at Tinker Creek, Annie Dillard, didn't she take some sort of public criticism in a similar vein to what you were just describing? The kind of
Yeah.
It's interesting to me because they're compared.
I mean, she wrote her undergrad or her master's thesis on Walden. So she loves Thoreau.
Yeah,
She's influenced by him. And I will say for Dillard,
but she's you read the book.
she's in suburbia.
Yeah, I mean, she's
like
tucking under a highway bridge.
Yes.
To a creekside, right, and writing about it. And
Yes.
Yeah.
And I do think Dillard she is more, I don't know if this is the right word, but she's more deceitful about it than Thoreau is. Like Thoreau is very open about it. He's not trying to do anything. Dillard is trying to hide some things. I mean, even the opening scene she has with the tomcat like bleeding on her, I think that was it happened to somebody else, or she sort of, it didn't happen to her at all.
Okay.
So parts of it are kind of...
You're on board with some of the criticism she received.
Yeah, I mean, I love Pilgrim at Tinker Creek. It's a beautiful book. But she is definitely constructing it even more than Thoreau is. And
she's almost feeding into the
mythos.
the American mythos that you're saying is a barrier to reading Thoreau.
I think so. That said, Dillard, I think, gets to, and part of why I like Pilgrim at Tinker Creek is, when I teach it, I tell my students, don't be deceived. This is like a drainage ditch. Like this is, and then when I taught it this spring, we were reading it by the creek that flows through campus, which used to be horribly polluted, and
Is
is
that
now
Wolf?
Yeah, Wolf Creek.
Wolf Creek, yeah.
Which now has fish in it, and is now. I wouldn't eat the fish, but they're there.
but they're back.
They're alive, yeah.
Yeah.
And I think it frees students to then, okay, let me see what life is here.
Yeah.
Even in these sort of non-spectacular. This is not Yosemite,
Yes.
but God's wildness is still present.
Yeah. Actually, I think that's a beautiful thing.
Yeah.
When I realized that about Pilgrim, it made me love it more.
Yeah.
Although there was a level of disappointment with,
like, wait a minute.
was
exactly.
she taking me for a ride? But actually, it does, for exactly the reason you just described. There's no excuse for any of us.
Yeah, that's it.
And Walden does that.
Yeah, and that's why I think Walden is so great for my students, because it invites them to just see where they are differently.
Yeah.
And recognize I don't have to go to a national park to observe carefully and attentively. And so I think there's all kinds of fun assignments you can do with students to help them do kind of Thoreauvian things in your place where you are, and realize you just have to kind of defamiliarize the place a little bit. Like spend a night outside in the parking lot. Do one thing a little different. Just get some distance, and it just shakes you out of your routine and helps you see life more deliberately, to use Thoreau's term.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I'll ask one more question. We're at the end of our time. You're as a professor and scholar a little bit outside of the classical education world. Obviously, have a lot of love and interest in investment, and your own children are Charlotte Mason-esque inspired, homeschool.
We use some cap stuff, some other things,
But with that kind of a little bit of a outsider's perspective, what are a couple of books you would recommend to classical school teachers, administrators that might be not a cap title, not one that's going to show up over and over again, but just slightly outside, but that would really expand a kind of understanding of the liberal arts or the classical tradition, rhetorical.
Wow, it's a tricky question, Jesse. It's good. I mean, I do think it helps to not get totally locked into a particular canon, right? So, Dorothy Sayers is great, but let's not just think about education in terms of Dorothy Sayers, right? So, part of that entails, doing what we tell our students to do and going back in the tradition. I think, I didn't really understand kind of education until I spent a lot of time reading through Dante and Milton again and again, and realizing the ways in which they are trying to educate their readers, and they're constructing explicitly pedagogical texts in really fascinating ways. So I think time reading old books is always time well spent, and there's definitely authors living today whose educational work or kind of work on liberal arts inspires me. But this summer, I reread Brothers Karamazov, which I haven't read for 15 years, and I was like, wow, I have so many questions. It's like things that I didn't see when I was a young 20s, I now see differently. And so I think some of those older books are worth, maybe as an administrator or a teacher, if they're outside of your discipline or you're not outside of your rotation, you might not have occasion to read Boethius Consolations every year. But you should at least read it every 10 years, and recognize that what's good for the goose is good for the gander. And if we tell our students these books are good, we too should be feeding our souls on them.
Very good. Thanks so much. It's great to have you with us.
Thanks, Jesse.
Appreciate it. You've been listening to ClassicalU's podcast. Thank you for tuning in. We release podcast episodes once a month with our presenters. Please also check out our live learning events, webinars in collaboration with Scholé Academy and Scholé Communities.